All right, and welcome everybody to the B&H Virtual Event Space. Today we have with us here Remy Park, who's going to be talking about styling and shooting food. So Remy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you for having me. I wanted to talk a little bit about food styling, food photography, the equipment that I use, and some of the things that I keep in mind when it comes to composition, lighting, props, like everything that goes into content creation, basically. So the main thing that I keep in mind when I'm starting is, of course, the food. And I would say lighting is probably the most important. Today is a little bit of an overcast day, which can be nice actually for kind of more of a subtle natural light. But I would say a day that's like a little bit more sunny is easier as well. As far as equipment, I feel like that's a good place to start. I usually shoot with a Canon 80D, and the lens that I use most often is a Sigma 35mm 1.4 lens. If you're using an iPhone or any other kind of camera though, you can absolutely make it work. I'm a firm believer in that. I would say then to focus a little bit more on the image itself. But with the camera, you have a lot more capability when you're editing the photo afterwards. So this is usually my go-to. And I usually use a tripod as well, which I think is really important for lower light situations and getting more of a crisp photo. But also if you're working on anything that's kind of like pour shots that you need both hands for, if you don't have somebody helping you, overhead shots, it's really nice to just have your camera already set up. And then the second piece of equipment that I think is really important are backdrops. You could use whatever kitchen surface that you have or your favorite surface of choice, but I find it really helpful to have, for example, these painted wood boards with a little bit of texture. And texture is really important too because it gives the photo more depth when you're editing or using them from distance, for example. So I would say that's really important. I have a couple that are kind of like a subway tile material, just like that, but it's actually a backdrop. I have a marble board, which is a little bit heavy. Try and lift it. And you can also use either light or dark. A really popular food style, I would say, is like very white and airy. But a lot of people also prefer something darker where it's like black and gray backdrops, and that can provide a lot of nice contrast for your food. So equipment, I would say the priority is figuring out what kind of camera you're going to use, the light source, and then the backdrops. And then after that, props are really important. So I probably have a few too many ceramic pieces, but props are one of my favorite things because they can really change the style of a photo, and all of these pieces are things that I use when I'm food styling. White is a great place to start just because when you're shooting colorful food, sometimes you want to be mindful of how many colors you have going on in one photo. So if, for example, my food is orange and my bowls are blue, it could either look really nice or really busy, depending on what your style is. Another important styling piece is linens. And I really like these because they're very nice for just adding a little bit of color, but also layers to your photo and like texture. Sometimes it can be a little bit boring if you're just having like a bowl on a backdrop and nothing else going on. So this adds a little bit of like movement, texture, and also extra depth if you want to place it underneath the bowl, for example. And if you want to work with color, but you have, let's say, a particular aesthetic or a mood that you like to stick to, using towels to add color to the food photo is a really great way to do that. So linens are really important. They're also pretty easy to find and pretty affordable as well, and functional because you'll actually use them in the kitchen. So that's that. I also like to keep a lot of little pinch pots and kind of small pours like this. Sometimes they won't actually be full, but it adds a little bit more interest to the photo. So I'm going to show you some of the composition styles that I like to do in just a second. And I think I'm going to do it actually with a bowl of actual oatmeal so I can show you guys what that might look like. So I'm going to grab this and, oh, where's my spatula? Okay. So when I think about food, I kind of think about the dish itself in layers. So when we're thinking about oatmeal, it does actually have its own texture, which can be really beautiful. But a plain bowl of oatmeal is usually not super interesting to look at for the most part. And it's kind of one-dimensional. It's got one color, a very bland sort of cream and brown color. So the way that I would draw that up though is think of it as more like a blank canvas. And when you're working with a bowl like this, the area that you have to style is much less. So what I would usually do in this situation, and I'm just going to switch to my other camera here. If I was using a smaller bowl, I would typically want to style more than one bowl. That way it's not just a flat image of just a bowl on a surface, if that makes sense. So I would usually do this, something like this. Maybe add a little cloth here for interest. This bowl would be full of oatmeal, and then I would kind of build off of that. So what I'm actually going to do to create more interest and just more surface area to play with is I'm going to switch this into a flatter dish. So let me switch back to my main camera. I'm going to switch to a larger bowl, and even though from the side it's going to look a lot more flat, from the top we're going to have a lot more surface to work with. So I'm going to grab this bowl, and then you'll see that realistically you probably wouldn't serve oatmeal in this kind of shallow bowl, but when you're working with food styling, you do want more surface area to play with. And the beauty of it is that when you're shooting from top down, you're not going to be able to see really how much is in there or how much isn't. So I'm going to put this over here. And now I'm going to grab some toppings. I'm going to do, I think, a banana, which is very similar in color. I'm going to do blueberries, which has a little bit of a difference in color, and then some small little pieces which will be used to add texture on top of that. So I'm going to just grab that. And toppings are a great way to add interest. So I have a lot of different toppings and jars, and this is kind of like the bread and butter of food styling. This is pretty much what makes the dish for me. It could be the most simple dish like toast or oatmeal, but it's all about the way that you style and present it. And this will definitely take a little bit of practice, but the more that you practice, the more you get used to layering things on, finding the balance between how much to add and how much is too much sometimes and overwhelms the photo, and also just finding your style. So you really should practice, kind of play with your food, and that's a great way to figure it out. Now we're going to take a banana. So what I'm going to start to do, and I will move this over here, is I'm going to start with my bowl of oatmeal. For color, I think I'm actually going to use, or for backdrop, I think what I'm going to do is use this linen. And it has a really nice waffle texture, which I really like because it adds a little bit of something to break up the white. And even though the bowl's kind of a white color, this is white and the backdrop is very white, there's a difference in texture and also the shade. So that's really helpful. And then I'm going to kind of maybe think about putting something here. And I really like a portrait style photo because I think when you're thinking about social media, it's a really great way to make it easy to then crop for different platforms like Pinterest, Instagram, you know, things like that. And then from here, I'm just going to think about maybe other props that I can use. So spoons, cutlery, things like that are also incredible props. Let me bring you over to my prop drawer, which is a little bit of a mess. But this is also a great place to start when you're styling food. And I'm going to go with this one. So your styling pieces don't necessarily always have to be the most practical. If you think that it looks nice in the photo, like this is a spoon I wouldn't really use in real life, but I think it's really nice and has its own texture that adds to the photo as well. So that's what I'm going to do for that. And then we can start with the toppings. So hopefully you'll be able to see this way. What I'm going to start with is kind of the bigger pieces. So I'm going to use a banana and slice that into coins. And you know, a big part of food styling is also a little bit of like food manipulation. I think we're probably all familiar with the way that food photography works in the industry. When we're thinking about maybe the way McDonald's, for example, styles their food photos, and we've all seen that photo of the burger with all of the ingredients like pushed to the front. So you can do the same thing with photos at home. Of course, I try to keep it as realistic as possible because I also want to eat the food afterwards. But some industry tricks that you could use would include spraying your food with oil to get a little bit of like a shine on top when you're photographing, you know, using shaving cream instead of whipped cream, things like that. So you can choose, you know, how much you want to commit to that aspect of it. But I personally prefer to keep things a little bit more natural because they are things that I do want to eat. But just something to think about if you're considering food photography or doing it, you know, professionally. So I just added a banana on top to start. I like to keep my pieces a little bit thicker, as you can probably see here, because it gives it a little bit more lift. And I think it just looks a little bit nicer than super thin layers. It builds a little volume and height in the photo. Then I'm gonna add, I think I'm gonna add the almonds. And I prefer the sliced almonds because they have color on the edge from the skin and the white. So it's not just white, it adds a little bit more dimension to the almonds themselves. I like to kind of concentrate on the side of a bowl or directly down the middle in a diagonal shape. So this will be sort of the main area of focus for this. I added maybe a little bit too much, but can be saved. And that's a great thing too, is you can play around, really take your time with food styling. Of course, if you're doing something frozen, you won't have as much time to work with it. But if you have the time and don't mind a little bit of cold food, then this is the best way to do it. It's just take your time, style, add layers. All right, so far I'm sticking to kind of the same neutral color palette, and I'll show you what it looks like from above. So we have the main layer, which is the oatmeal. Then we have the banana, the sliced almonds, and I added some buckwheat groats, which are kind of like puffed grain. And then I think what I'm gonna do is I do wanna add a little bit of color. So I'm gonna add maybe some goji berries for some interest. And then I'm gonna layer on some kind of sweetener as a drizzle, mostly for the photo, which I think will look really great. So we move on here to this little cabinet. It's really nice too if you use toppings often to keep them kind of organized like this so that they're easy to handle. And since this is something that I do most days, and I do for a living now, that is to be super helpful. So I'm going to grab these goji berries and sprinkle them on top. And as you can probably see, my actual kitchen island is more of a wood color. And I think it's a really beautiful color for food photography as well. But since I prefer something a little bit more neutral and white, a great way to get around that without having to, you know, redo your whole apartment is just to use backdrops. And you can paint them yourself. There are places that you can purchase them nowadays. You can really get thrifty. You can use like a sheet, something like that. And I'm just gonna add in these little goji berries now. So I will admit that sometimes I do get a little bit more, I guess, like nitpicky with it, and I'll use actual food tweezers to make things more precise. But sometimes I think that food looks really beautiful when you're just doing things naturally and kind of just doing things as they would. I think that, you know, there's a difference between food that looks realistic and food that looks like something you get at a Michelin restaurant. So it really comes down to your style, but yeah, either way it works. Okay, and now what I'm gonna do is add some milk and also a little drizzle of a sweetener. Actually, I'll leave it right here. So for this, we're just building more layers and more layers, and I like to think of it as contrasted. So if I think about the oatmeal, it's kind of light in color, the bananas are light, the almonds have a little bit of darkness, the buckwheat groats have lightness to them, and the goji berries are also a little bit more dark. So I do think it's looking a little bit too one-dimensional. I'm going to add just a drizzle of something dark for some contrast, which will look really nice in the photo. So for that, I'm going to use date syrup, which I think looks really nice. This will be a little bit more important, so definitely be patient when you have steps that are going to kind of change the look of the dish, and take your time, because once you do it, you can't go back when it's something like this. So I'll show you from the top-down view. So I'm going to go back and forth like this. And that just adds a nice little texture. I think at this point, I'm happy with how it looks. I don't want to take it too far, because sometimes when you do too much, it can end up being very distracting and hard to tell what the food is. So I'm going to leave it at that. And then I'm gonna bring a little bit of some almond milk to pour over top. Or soy milk. And then when it comes to shooting the actual photo, what I want to think about is the directional angle of the photo. So usually there are 3 kinds of photos that I like to do. The first one is overhead, so taking the photo from a top-down direction, and this is kind of like the typical food blogger direction that you'd see, like if you're at a restaurant and you see people, you know, on their phones. It's a very like top-down. That's really nice when you have a bunch of elements going on. It's framed nicely, or your dish has a lot of interest and layers built, like we just did with the oatmeal. And then the other angle that I would do is more of a 45-degree angle. And that's a little bit nicer for building depth in the photo. So that would be kind of like this. This is the camera. This would be the 90 angle, and this would be the 45. And that gets a little bit more depth. So you get some nice background blur if you like that look in your photos. You get to focus on something closer to the camera and have the back a little bit more blurred out. And that's really nice if you have something in the front that you want more attention played to. And the last angle that I would do, which wouldn't necessarily work for this photo, would be a straight on angle like this. And that's really nice when you have something that's stacked in height. Let's say like a sandwich that's sliced in half and stacked on top of each other. That would look really nice from a straight on angle like this. So those are just some of the angles that I use. 3 most common ones. Of course, there are times when I'm playing around and different things work better. But again, it's all about just playing around, see what works best. And on average, I really do take a ton of photos of just one dish because you just never know what you're gonna end up liking later when you're editing in post. So that is how I would style that. So once you have this kind of set up, you can start playing around with photo shots, which would be like me pouring the milk in, for example. I think that'd be a great shot. You can experiment with putting this in different places. So you could place this on top of the dish. You could place this on the side. You could place it in the oatmeal. And typically I'll have kind of a shot list ready. So I'll talk through all the steps that I want to do. I want to shoot it plain, then with milk, then with a spoon in it. And it's all about variety. You can really get a lot of different looks out of one dish. And I would say that's probably ideal because it does take a little bit more effort when you're shooting food and you're taking a photo of it too and you've cooked it. So really maximize the time that you put into, let's say, preparing one dish. Okay, so to give you an idea of how it would look, this is how it would look as the final shot from an overhead view. And I like this because it has a bit of a diagonal direction here. So all of the elements are kind of in the corners. I find that to look really nice because it gives it a more balanced look. I could move the spoon on top like this. I could place it into the oatmeal. And if I was doing kind of a 45-degree angle, it would look something more like this. So as you can see, since this is a pretty flat dish, it wouldn't maybe be as nice looking, but if I had something with more height, it would look really beautiful. And then of course, finally, the straight on, which doesn't really work with this specific dish. So that is kind of the basics of how I think about composition. And from there, you can really start playing around. If I don't like the napkin, for example, I could switch that out and I could use a linen that's more like this. I could also focus on maybe adding another smaller dish. And even when you're taking photos, you can change like how much you're cropping into the image. So normally I would take one from sort of further away. Then I would take one that's a little bit closer, focus on the details, more of a macro shot. It's always good to have variety because even though you can crop images when you're processing them later, I find that it's best to do things on your camera as much as possible because you do lose a lot of quality the more you have to process a photo. So as much as you can, try and get the image to your liking or as close as you can to your liking on the actual camera. And that could mean that, you know, let's say there's a piece of banana that's kind of hanging off here and I think to myself, I'll just get rid of it in Photoshop. I would personally spend the time to just remove it because you'll save a lot of time editing the multiple photos, but also you'll preserve a little bit more of the quality of the actual image. So that's personally the way that I like to work. Now, if you're working with a phone, a really great thing is that you can actually use your camera to both shoot and edit the photo. So you can use Lightroom, which is the same app that I use on my laptop. I do prefer the camera Lightroom because, or sorry, the laptop Lightroom version because there are more capabilities that are not available on the free phone app. However, if you want to stick to just your phone, you could also use Snapseed, which has great editing tools. There are some where you can add filters like Visco, for example. I do prefer something that is a little bit more manual and you can touch up things like on Snapseed with a brush or Lightroom that just gives you more control. And when I'm thinking about editing, I think a lot about exposure, shadows, curves, highlights, and the amount and the intensity of the blacks, for example. So there's a lot you can do with it, but I think the most important thing is to really nail the shot as much as you can, and be as happy as you can be with it from your camera or your phone to start off. And again, doing as little processing as you can is usually the best. So especially on an iPhone, some of the things that I feel like are really great is to increase the sharpening a little bit. But if you do it too much, I do think it's a little grainy. Let's see, it looks like we have a question. Let's see. What lens? Okay, so the lens that you use, there's a lens called the pancake lens, which is really great for an overhead. And that just helps to preserve any warping that usually may happen sometimes naturally. You can fix that in post as well, but I do think that things are a little bit nicer when you don't have to process again, like I said, to maintain the quality of the image. I am currently using the 35mm 1.4 lens, which is a great lens. However, you do have to get significantly further away with this because it is a different length camera lens wise. Another great one would be the 18 to 35mm, which I also have. A 50mm 1.4 lens is another great one, a starter lens, I would say, or even 50mm 1.8 is also really nice. But yeah, you can do a lot with a tripod as well. This is the Manfrotto tripod. They do have this at B&H, by the way, as well as like all the cameras that I'm talking about. And these are great because you can set up your food either on the floor or at an appropriate distance so that no matter what lens you're using, you can get as close or as wide of a shot as you'd like. Macro lenses are also wonderful. If you want to get 100mm lens, I think that's a great way to go if you prefer something that's a little bit more close up. And I would actually recommend, if you're able to rent a lens from a place like B&H, for example, because you can just kind of see how they look. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell until you actually try and practice. So you can experiment with a bunch of different lenses and see what works best for your preferred food photography. If you're working on a restaurant shoot, though, I would recommend something that allows you to be a little bit more wide in your shot. That way you have options when you're in a not controlled setting. So a restaurant, not your home, for example. And yeah, that would be it, I think, for lenses. If you are working with your iPhone, you could get little attachable lenses as well if you wanted something more macro, and that could change your photography as well. Another quick hack could be to actually shoot your photo using the Camera Plus app. There are a couple of apps for the iPhone camera that will help to, I guess, give you a little bit more control over the image that you're shooting to start with. And then if you're on an Android, I have never really used an Android myself, but I've been told that there are a lot more manual functions when you're shooting with that camera on an Android. And also they give you like raw capabilities, I believe, as well. So that's really, really great if you do have an Android. But no matter what you're using, you can really make it work. My work personally, I would say, is a mix between phone quality photos, which you honestly can't really tell nowadays sometimes the difference because the cameras have gotten so great and high quality. And for the most part, though, it is definitely DSLR stuff. If you want something kind of in between, a great place to start could be a mirrorless digital camera, which takes a little bit of the guesswork out for you. It's kind of like a cross between a digital point and shoot and a DSLR. So you have options, but definitely play around, experiment, see what works best for you in your style of photography. And then also just really play around with renting things if you can and you're able to, because it's a great way for you to practice without commitment. These things can definitely be a little bit more expensive, so keep that in mind for sure. And I guess the last thing that I want to talk about is presets. Presets, I think, are really great because if you do have a specific mood in mind and something that you consistently like as a style of photo, it's a great way for you to just apply the same. You could think of it like a filter, basically, on all your food photos. And when you're batch processing, let's say 90 photos of this oatmeal, it's a great way for you to just go through and make the same edits to all of the photos. So that's a great way to go. There are a lot of presets available. One thing that I do want to say about presets and editing photos is that I think it is important with food that you keep the color true to its natural food state. So you want to avoid maybe your vegetables or green produce items looking kind of a teal or blue color. I think that is a beautiful way to style, but for most food purposes and my food photography clients, they specifically stay away from things like that. However, if you have goji berries, like mine are not looking too vibrant or red, I might up the color because it will still look natural. I just wouldn't make them, let's say, orange or purple, for example. So that's definitely something that I think is different from using presets on any other kind of photo and food photos, is that you do want your food to look like food at the end of the day. Let's see, if we have any more questions, let me know and we can go into anything else. But that's basically it. And again, it's really all about just using the equipment that you have. It doesn't have to be fancy or expensive whatsoever. And if you are, let's say, working with something simple, if I don't have all of my equipment on hand, I'll just make sure that I'm doing the work in person to make the photo look as close to what I would want as possible. And that is the best thing you can do. You know, play with your food, be open to cold food, because I do eat quite a lot of cold food. And yeah.
That was really great. I enjoyed seeing the process there. We did have a couple questions. Somebody on Facebook is asking about lighting. Do you use natural or artificial light?
So I use natural light 90% of the time, just because it's my preference. But when it comes to something that has a little bit of shine on it, I would prefer to add a little bit of like that highlight to get that gloss and the reflection. If you're shooting drinks especially, it's nice to have artificial light. But I still go for a natural light look with artificial light. So what I use is a Godox light. And the biggest tip that I have, because it's taken me a long time to find natural light that I like, is to use an umbrella that is like giant, because that diffuses the light enough to the point where it's going to look like a natural window light coming in. So it's kind of important, I think, if you live somewhere that's not super sunny, like New York, for example, and it starts to get, you know, colder and the days get shorter, it's great to have that flexibility and use artificial light.
Yeah, definitely. And can you talk a little bit about how you post-process your images? You know, what program do you use? And yeah.
So I usually use Lightroom. That's my favorite editing app. I think I've tried Photo One. I didn't really love it as much, so I use Lightroom for almost everything. And the presets that I mentioned earlier, you can use as well on Lightroom, which is really helpful. The first step, though, that I usually go through is photoshopping out any kind of blemishes. So that could be like spills of food in the background. It could be a smudge on the edge of a bowl. But typically, I would try to manage those things before I'm shooting the photo. Sometimes you miss it, though. So that's definitely the first step, is to just get rid of any blemishes. Then I work on the actual photo, and the first thing is adjusting the light. So the highlights, I usually turn down a little bit. The shadows, I'll usually bump up a little bit, and the black, I'll usually bump down to the left, which I think is increasing them a little bit. And I typically don't play with contrast too much, just because I feel like using the highlights and the blacks and the shadows can give me more control over the similar effect. I do use clarity and sharpening. I'll bump up a little bit as well, but only so much that it looks natural. And then I'll use the brush tool, which I think is the best feature of using the laptop version of Lightroom, is that you can spot touch specifically what you want to do. So if I wanted to, let's say, sharpen up the bananas on top, I could go in with the brush and sharpen the bananas. Then I use curves a little bit, tethered. Then I'll use curves, and that's about it. I would say I use the HSL sliders a little bit as well to manipulate the color, but not too much, only to the point where it looks natural, but kind of like better a little bit. You know, natural, but a little bit better. That's kind of my goal. And question about shooting tethered. So typically I don't shoot tethered too often unless I'm working on something that is going to hold up for a very long time. So product photography, I would use that. But the reality is I usually shoot about 5 to 6 different recipes during the day. So I find that it's a little easier for me because I want to sometimes take the camera off the tripod, move around with it. I have a little bit more freedom when I'm not shooting tethered, but that is a great way to kind of see how it looks before you commit to the shot. And you can also kind of set it up where the camera is set up on a tripod, tether it to your laptop, even your iPad, for example, to see what it looks like. And that's a great way to figure out composition and what looks well. Do different clients want different depths of field? That's a great question. So I find that when I'm doing product photography or a recipe for a client, it is really important that you're not using too much, or that your aperture is maybe not so wide, because let's say I'm doing this Trader Joe's soy milk, and we'll just pretend this is the shot. And this is the recipe, and this is the product behind it. The intention is to say, we used this product to make the oatmeal, right? So when you blow it out too much and the background is so blurred to the point where you can't really make out what this is, that is not the best shot for the client. So one thing that I might do is like switch the order, have this kind of blurred out in the background and this more in focus, or just chill out a little bit, make it less blurry in the background, have more things in focus. And that's also nice when you have, a lot of detail in your styling. You may not want to blur out everything, because then you're not able to see all the elements in the photo. So hopefully that helps with that question.
Yeah. I want to go over to Facebook. We have a couple questions there. Lizzie is asking, how do you style really brown food, like a vegetable stew?
That's a great question. Brown food is some of the most delicious food, but definitely difficult to make look nice sometimes. So my tip would be using garnish. You could put some crushed nuts on top, which also adds texture and interest. You could do a swirl of a yogurt of some kind, which is also functional. It's pretty delicious with the soup. You could add fresh herbs for some bright green. So even like a little drizzle of olive oil might help to break it up. Or you could experiment with plating it in a bowl that's really colorful, or a pot that has a little bit of color on it. So those are some great ways to kind of brighten up brown food. Let's see, do I ever mess up? And if I do, how do I fix it? Do I have an example of something that I used to do a lot? That's a great question. I definitely mess things up sometimes. So I'll speak with an example in mind. I recently did an ice cream shoot, and that was one of the most challenging shoots that I did for a client, because the product itself, I used a real product. I wasn't using like fake ice cream or anything like that. So I had to be very quick with the way I was working. And usually what I'll do is I'll prepare like a bunch in advance. So I'll have, let's say for one flavor, I have like 3 pints of that one flavor. So for each of them, I think I had about 20 pints of ice cream in my freezer at one point. It sounds a little bit ridiculous, but the reality is sometimes when you mess it up, you need to just plop on some extra. The same thing if I'm working with soup, I try to make more than I need. And I do live alone, so I do have a lot of leftovers, but you can always give them away to friends. I just find that it's easier than getting all the way to the shoot point and then realizing you don't have enough of what you need, and then having to start cooking again, but your food kind of dries out or whatever it is. So I hope that's helpful. Any suggestions on shooting pizza? That's a great question. So pizza is definitely a little bit more of a challenging one for me, because I think the best way to capture that is from a top-down angle. I would say to garnish it a little bit more, play around with the colors. Even though it's typically like a red, orange food, you could make a white pizza, you could play around with fresh herbs, you could add some really fun garnish. And another way to create like more of an interesting shot would be to, do I have a plate around? Is to grab, let's say, a plate and shoot 3 plates with a slice on each. That way the photo looks a little bit different, not just like a pizza. You could also play around with like a really close-up shot and details of like what's going on with the toppings. I think that would be really beautiful. And that is a case in which you might want to shoot it while it's still hot, when the cheese is like melty, when there's like a little bit of that grease on top, which may not sound the most appetizing, but is really nice for bringing out the highlights in the photo. And you get the nice little reflection of light on the grease.
Awesome. Now, Kristen is asking, I'm not sure if we covered this already, but what software do you use for your presets? Do you do it on your laptop, and did you buy your presets from somewhere?
So presets I use both on my phone and also on my laptop. I created them on my laptop, which I think is easier because there are a couple of things you can't adjust quite as much on your phone version of Lightroom. So I believe the phone version of Lightroom is free. So usually what I'll do is I'll create the preset on my laptop, and then I've imported them onto my phone so I can use them. But I will say for each kind of recipe that I'm shooting or setup, I typically find that I'll create kind of a new preset every time, because there are different colors in every dish. I don't shoot a lot of blue because blue isn't really a common food color that comes up. So I find that taking the blues down helps to reduce any of like that sort of blue that you get on like a cloudy day. But of course, if I was shooting blueberries, then I'd have to use a different preset. So I usually have like a base, then I modify, and then I'll use that preset I've created for that set of images and apply it to all of them. Okay, quick question about natural light and filling light. So do I use a fill light when shooting with natural light, or just embrace the occasional intense shadow? I'm not a huge fan of shadow, although that is a very trendy look nowadays. I feel like that's actually really beautiful and like very editorial. One example I can think of is like Sakara Life has a very contrasted, stark light kind of look with a lot of intense shadows, and that is definitely a style. I personally don't get a lot of that intense light unless it's like first thing in the morning, so I don't have that problem too much, but I would say the most important thing, if you are experiencing that and you don't like it, you could use a lot of diffusers. You could kind of use a sheer curtain over the window, or just get like a simple white kind of diffusing sheet, if that makes sense. So, or you could also use a reflector on the other side to bounce the light. And then, how do you avoid feeling boisterous when you're using so much food? That's a great question. I think it really comes down to just thinking of it as like food that is like a product more than like food that you're about to eat. I personally really like to shoot when I'm already full. I feel like that's helpful, because when I'm hungry and let's say I'm going to eat this bowl of oatmeal, I don't have as much patience, and I feel like that is something that would cause me to sort of rush the shoot. Yeah, I would say I separate food that I'm eating from the food that I style, but I do eat a lot of leftovers. So anything that I don't eat right away goes into the freezer, and then I have it for another day. It's very rare that I shoot something and then eat it right after, if that makes sense. It's kind of a little bit of a, unfortunate thing, but that's kind of the reality of shooting food.
Yeah, can you talk about how a little bit how you capture like hot foods with steam nicely?
Oh, hot foods with steam. I think it can be really beautiful, especially in video, but it is difficult when you're doing like an overhead, for example. You don't want the steam blowing directly into your lens. So the best way I find to offset that is to have a little fan coming from like the side to blow the steam to the side, so you don't get that in your shot. Or another thing you could do is shoot it by the window so that some of the steam is kind of flowing out subtly. If you want to capture it though, I think the best way to do it is to use a darker backdrop, so you have that contrast to show the steam and the light not to be so stark, because it's all about just making sure it's actually visible, and you can also adjust that later in post. But yeah, I would say a 45-degree angle or like a straight on angle would be the best for that.
Very cool. And Kristen on live stream is asking if you could explain more in depth how you use the umbrella for your lighting.
Okay, so for the umbrella, basically, if you can imagine, the light is like about this big, and the umbrella that I have is like this big, and it's actually like an octagonal softbox umbrella. So it's very, very big in my little studio apartment, but it really makes a difference, because otherwise you end up with that stark light look, or kind of the light look that you get from just like having your lights on in your apartment. So it's really just all about diffusing it. And my personal favorite way to shoot food is having the light coming from an angle from the side or from the back. I'm not a huge fan of light head on and then shooting from the same direction, because I think that sometimes it's a little bit too intense. So picking it up from the side, like if this is the food, I might set up the light on the side here, or set it up from behind, which may sound like it wouldn't look too great, but it actually gives it a really nice like soft glow from behind. So yeah, hopefully that helps answer the question. And let's see. Laura asked, other than the camera, what tools do you use if you use any others? Tripods, filming videos, taking videos of yourself, pouring drinks. So the main equipment that I use really quickly is a DSLR camera, or you could use your phone or whatever camera that you have. I do use a tripod. I don't always use it, but I really do like it for, like you said, 4 shots, video, of course, and I do usually work alone, so if I don't have assistance, that's the best way to just have the camera set and ready to go. I have the Canon app on my phone, and I would say most cameras nowadays have the app on the phone where you could control your camera from your phone as well. So if you want to like be a little bit further away, shoot the trigger from your phone and then be pouring something. And what else? Filming videos, I use the same camera. The Canon 80D does have video capability. I know that a lot of people are a big fan of the Sony Alpha for video especially, so that's a great thing to look into as well. And I would say the last thing, tripod-wise for video, if you have a tripod that has like a smooth swivel, that's really important for getting yeah, basically just a smooth pan instead of like kind of like a shaky pan. When you do it by hand, it's very hard to be stable enough to just get it without like, the shakiness. Did I learn about lighting through trial and error, or did you find resources for what you use to achieve your desired aesthetic? I would say I guess it's trial and error. I kind of looked at what I liked in photos in general, and I always prefer the look of natural light. I think that colors look more vibrant and more true to what they actually are, like compared to the eye. But I had to kind of train myself to be open to using artificial light because I don't always have the luxury of light coming in all the time. And I used to tell my mom that I was kind of feeling like Shrek because I was to like run home when the sun was still home. When the sun was still bright, I wanted to be at home shooting photos. And it can be very limiting, to kind of like base your schedule around when the sun is highest. So if you can, artificial light is great. You can also use flash, which is super affordable. You can find like simple flash attachments. But yeah, definitely a learning curve because I still think natural light is the easiest to work with aside from the changes and fluctuations in the light.
And what's like the most difficult food that you've worked with, or something that took a lot of practice to master?
Ooh, the most difficult to photograph for me, I would say it used to be soup because I find that things would like often sink to the bottom. So I use like a couple of tricks, which is number one, load the soup up with like tons of things. Like it's a little bit unrealistic the amount of filling to broth that you have, but it's really for the photo. And the other difficulty that I had was definitely smoothie bowls because similar things would easily sink down and you have definitely limited window of time during which you can shoot it before it just completely melts. So things that are super hot or super cold, generally I find a little bit more difficult to work with.
All right, very cool. I think I don't see any more questions here on social media. I think we covered everything. Um, Really a lot of great information. That demonstration was really cool. Um, all right, so I guess we'll wrap it up if nobody else has any questions. Um, so thank you so much for joining us, Remy. That was really great, and thank you to all of our viewers. We'll see you next time here at the B&H Virtual Event Space.
Thank you.